Media scientist.
Hmm.
That's it's a title that makes you wonder, right? What pops into your head when you hear that? I know when I first saw this, all this RoleCatcher stuff you sent, the guides, the interview prep, I was hooked. Feels like we're both kind of obsessed with how media really ticks, like the behind the scenes, not just the stuff everyone sees.
It really is something how this whole field brings together so many different things. You've got media studies, sociology, even psychology. Heck, even tech is a big part of
Oh,
it.
totally.
We're not just talking about like analyzing some movie in a classroom. It's about how it hits people, like society as a whole. And what's really wild is how RoleCatcher gives you this peek into like the actual skills you'd need to work in that world.
So let's break this whole media scientist thing down a bit. What are they actually doing all day? Because something tells me it's not just watching the latest season of, well, whatever's hot right now.
Yeah, no, you won't be catching up on shows for work, that's for sure. It's more about digging into the how and the why of how media gets to us. They look at how people use media, what we're watching, reading, all that, and then figure out how those choices, they actually change our attitudes, even our beliefs.
That's really interesting, the whole documentation part. What's so important about that? Like, what's that look like, actually doing it?
It's all about making the connections. Let's say there's some big news story, right?
Yeah.
And everyone's going crazy about it. A media scientist would look at how different places are showing that story, how people online are talking about it. Then they'd analyze how seeing those words, those images, how that changes what people think.
So it's kind of like being, I don't know, a detective of the mind. But instead of fingerprints, it's like you're following what they watch and read.
That's a good way to put it.
It's a deep dive, for sure.
Hmm.
So where do all these media detectives, these media scientists, where do they actually work?
It might surprise you. RoleCatcher talks about the usual suspects like universities, research places, but they're also at media companies, those think tanks, even NGOs.
Okay, so not just stuck in some lab somewhere. What about the vibe, though? Like, is it all brainstorming in a room, or is it more like heads down research?
Working together is huge at this kind of job. Imagine working with data people to crunch numbers, or with psychologists to see how, like, an ad makes you feel. You might even be presenting your findings to, like, politicians and stuff.
Sounds crazy dynamic. But let's be real. Every job has its good and bad, right? What's RoleCatcher saying? What's the perks? But also, what are we signing up for?
Well, they're definitely in demand, media scientists, and that usually means good money and room to grow. But honestly, there's something really cool about being the one to figure out how media is shaping the world.
Okay, yeah, I have to admit that's pretty awesome. But what about the tough parts? RoleCatcher can't just be making it all sound rosy, right?
Of course not. I think the biggest hurdle is how fast everything changes. New apps, new tech, new trends. It's constant, so you gotta be able to roll with it. A media scientist needs to love learning to stay ahead of the game.
Right, makes sense. This whole media world moves so fast. But is it all about chasing the next big thing, or are there like core skills you always need no matter what the tech is?
You've hit on something important. Adapting is key, but the fundamentals go deeper. You gotta be good at research, analyzing data, and maybe the most important, communicating.
Communicating. Okay, that's interesting. How does that work for a media scientist? Is it writing papers, doing presentations, or something totally different?
All of that, and then some. Think about it. You might need to explain some complex data, like maybe about what people watch, but you have to make it easy to get. Whether you're writing a report, making a fancy chart, or even doing some social media thing about it.
So it's not enough to be a numbers person, you got to be a storyteller too.
Yeah.
You need to make that data mean something to people. That's a pretty unique combo. It makes you wonder, someone who loves this kind of stuff, data A&D storytelling, they'd have a pretty unique education, wouldn't they? Like, how do you become a media scientist?
You're spot on. You'll find people with backgrounds you'd expect, like communications degrees. But RoleCatcher points out how much variety there is, sociology, even political science. It's all there.
Makes sense when you say it like that.
To really get how media messes with us, you got to get people, culture, all of it.
There's that whole mix and match thing again, huh? Combining the brainy stuff with, like, actually understanding people. That's got to be what makes this field so, I don't know, so interesting. And probably hard to pin down, too.
Exactly. And that takes us to something really cool that RoleCatcher gets into, where your career can go as a media scientist. They've got these different stages from starting out all the way to like running the whole show.
Okay, career paths, always love a good map. So what's the journey like? Take us from day one to like media scientist king.
Okay, so picture this. You're fresh out of school, maybe with that media studies degree, ready to take on the world. Those first jobs, you're usually helping out the experienced researchers. It's all about learning the ropes, collecting data, the different ways to do research. You're seeing how it all works in the real world.
So it's like an apprenticeship for media geeks.
Yeah.
You're not just reading about it anymore, you're actually doing it.
Exactly. And RoleCatcher, they're big on this one thing networking. Going to those conferences, meeting other researchers. It's how you learn from the best and make a name for yourself.
The old it's who you know, right? Although, seems like in this field, it's both who and D, what you know. So what about when you've got some experience under your belt? You start climbing that ladder. What then?
Once you're past those first jobs, it's time to step up. Imagine you're creating your own research projects, digging into huge piles of data to find something new. And then, this is important, you gotta tell people about it.
So you go from number cruncher to like the one with all the answers. You're not just analyzing anymore, you're shaping the whole conversation. But what about at the very top? What does a media scientist superstar actually do?
Think big picture. We're talking setting the research goals for, like, whole companies. You're influencing what politicians do, maybe even changing how everyone sees how media works.
Whoa, okay, now that's making a difference. But how do you get to that level? It's got to be more than just like working late.
You're right. It's this thing, continuous learning. The media world is always changing. New platforms, algorithms, how we actually use this stuff, it's never the same. So no matter what level you're at, you got to adapt, got to keep learning.
Sounds like if you don't like learning new stuff, this might be the wrong job, huh? You're never really done, are you?
Nope. And that's part of what makes it so cool. What's wild is RoleCatcher actually gives you examples of what each stage looks like. You see what it's really like to be a media scientist from day one to running the show.
That's super useful. Okay, so we've covered the skills, the school stuff, the career stuff, but I got to ask, what are some of the tools of the trade? How does a media scientist go beyond just watching and actually measure how media gets to us?
Now that's where it gets fun. They've got a whole bunch of tricks up their sleeves. One way is ethnographic study. Basically, they dive headfirst into some online community or like a social media site. They want to see how people use media in their natural habitat.
So like some kind of digital anthropologist, studying the tribes of the internet. I like it. What else?
Another big one is sentiment analysis. That's where they use these computer programs to go through tons of text, like social media posts, to see the emotion, the opinions behind the words. They're putting numbers to those gut feelings we get from media.
So instead of just saying, hey, people seem mad about this, they can actually measure how mad across like thousands of conversations. That's wild.
You got it. And then there's experimental design. This is where they get to create these controlled environments, like showing people different versions of an ad or a news story to see how tiny changes can change their minds.
Sounds complicated. I bet there's a lot to think about when you're building those experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot to juggle, huh? It's like you need to get the research, the data, A&D, have a little psychology in you to really get it.
Yeah, it's not just about the numbers themselves. It's about what they mean in the real world with all its messiness. And RoleCatcher talks about that a lot. You need that human touch along with all the technical stuff.
Okay, so we've hit on the skills, the education, even how you move up in this world. But what about the future? Media changes so fast. How do media scientists keep up?
$1 million question right there. And it's something anyone who wants to do this should be thinking about. We're already seeing VR and AR blowing up, AI getting smarter every day. It's changing how we even see media, let alone how we use it.
It's like the Wild West out there, but with screens. How do media scientists even wrap their heads around all that new stuff? What skills do they need for that?
One big thing is they got to get good at the tech itself. Imagine a media scientist who not only gets what's happening in a VR world, but how it makes you feel being in it. Or someone who can break down those AI algorithms that decide what news we see and figure out how that changes our minds.
So they got to learn the language of all this tech almost, like learning to code in VR or something.
Kinda. But it's bigger than that. It's about how that tech messes with our heads, with how we act, both on our own and as a group.
Right, right.
And that's where all that stuff we talked about before, the research, the data, even how you talk about it, that's what makes a media scientist stand out. It's about connecting that tech stuff with being human.
So this whole field is about being okay with not knowing everything, about always learning new stuff.
Pretty much. That's what makes it exciting.
Yeah, no crystal ball to tell us what's next. But we know media scientists are going to be the ones figuring it out, right? Helping us understand how this tech is changing things.
And maybe even more than that, helping us deal with those changes in a way that's, smart, responsible.
That's a big job. But man, what an exciting one. To everyone listening who's thinking about diving into this media science world, get ready. It's a wild ride.
And hey, who knows? Maybe one of you listening will be the one to make the next big discovery in this whole thing.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating look into the world of emerging careers.